Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about early childhood in chapter 4. I'm not going to talk like that, all 105 slides, but that would have been, I guess, mildly amusing at first, but then more irritating after each slide. So let's just start this beast. So we talk about physical growth. Kids, they are growing. The brain is 75% of its adult weight by 3 years of age. At 6 years of age, it's 95% of its adult weight. So we're seeing rapid neural development in early childhood. So one neuro or part of the brain that I want to highlight is the corpus callosum. Brain hemispheres work together through the corpus callosum. There are not two separate brains, as I said before. So the corpus callosum connects the two brain hemispheres. It's typically referred to as a superhighway between hemispheres because there is a lot of white matter connecting these two hemispheres, and then that allows for rapid communication between the two hemispheres, as we talked about before with myelination. Growth spurt between ages 3 and 6, improved coordination between right and left hemisphere tasks. Children younger than 6 demonstrate difficulty coordinating an Etch-a-Sketch because their corpus callosum is not developed enough to integrate their movements of both hands. So pretty straightforward here. The hemispheres have to be able to communicate in order to coordinate movements with different parts of the body because, as reviewed in the previous chapter, the left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere of your brain controls your left side of the body. So now looking specifically at children's art, one interesting cross-cultural finding is this idea that everybody is drawing tadpoles, but there are variations in the size and the shape and what features are emphasized within the tadpoles. Children from Western cultures and urban educated non-Western contexts drew larger images with more facial detail and more positive emotion. Children in non-Western world contexts depict themselves as smaller, with less facial details and a more neutral emotional expression. Cultures which emphasize the social group rather than the individual may be one of the factors for the smaller size of the figure. So the idea here is individualized culture. So we're going to emphasize, the self. We're going to emphasize facial expressions. We're going to make ourselves the centerpiece of the photo or the drawing in this case. So I always found cultural variations in art interesting. Like I kind of reviewed in the previous slide, if you're an individualized culture, if you're in the West, generally, but there are cross-cultural variations. In the West, the Western artists will focus on the self. They'll draw larger faces, and the point is to bring attention to that individual, and it dominates the scene. And there was actually a specific study that looked at East Asian college students and American college students, and they were just told, "Hey, draw a landscape." And in the left corner, you can see the differences. The left side is the Americans drawing, and the right side is the East Asian drawings. And the East Asians tended to provide a more complex background. They drew a horizon that was much higher in the picture than the American drawing. And East Asians were more likely than Americans to situate their objects in context. So again, kind of focusing on the difference here is kind of this collectivist culture, broadly speaking. They emphasize the environment, all these other features in the environment. Well, I mean, at least for me, I can speak for myself, I always drew the kind of the sun, even though I have awful drawing abilities. My drawing abilities are effectively zero, but I always drew it similar to the portrait on the left side, and that reflects a cultural difference. The beginning of the sexual self. Support for Freud's argument that infants are sexual beings. Young infants derive pleasure from oral activities. Both male babies and female babies have been observed to experience physical arousal, undergo what appears to be orgasms. Moving on to nutrition, health, and wellness. Motor vehicle crashes cause the largest number of fatal injuries. Nutrition. Most children do not eat the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables, not surprising. Uh, but under conditions of stressful households, such as loud noise, fighting, violence, children will seek out more comfort foods. And that's kind of what you probably understand that based on your everyday life experiences. You're stressed out, I'm going to go hit up McDonald's or whatever. Physical activity, neighborhoods that provide safe outdoor activities have fewer overweight children. And again, kind of straightforward. Both improve executive function and change in fMRI studies. So the idea here is exercise is good. It improves your physical health, your cognitive health, and it actually acts as a protective factor against some stressors. But obviously, if you live in a more dangerous neighborhood for whatever domestically or internationally, your opportunities to safely exercise are limited, and that could contributes to uh, delayed cognitive or physical growth in certain areas of the world. So continuing with our boy Piaget, we're now entering the pre-operational stage. Children use symbols to represent words, images, and ideas, which is why children in this stage engage in pretend play. Preschooler, symbolic capacity. Children can now use words to refer to things, people, and events that are not physically present. Can refer to past and future. Pretend or fantasy play flourishes at this age. Imaginary companions associated with advanced cognitive and social development. So the idea here is that your child is not losing their mind, or maybe they are, but that's irrelevant to the fact that they have an imaginary friend. It's actually associated with the ability to symbolically imagine someone, and it serves social development because you can have a complete conversation with this person and kind of simulate different social scenarios, which encourages social cognitive growth. Piaget's Three Mountains task to evaluate egocentrism. So one of the big features of Piaget is that he believed that kids are just kind of obsessed with themselves, like kind of egomaniacs, and you can kind of see the culture that Piaget tests these children and his children really um, are obviously going to impact that conclusion. So let's read off some of these bullet points. Tendencies of young children not to be able to take the perspective of others. Again, very egocentric. Piaget asked children to choose a drawing that shows what the display of three mountains would look like from a particular vantage point. So the idea here is that if that very disturbing looking doll to the right hand side, if the girl on the left was asked, oh, okay, what is this Bride of Chucky seeing? The girl on the left would conclude that the perspective of the Bride of Chucky is the same as hers. That is the view of the mountain. However, future studies found that by reducing tasks to bare essentials, several researchers have demonstrated that preschool children are not as egocentric as Piaget claimed. So basically, the idea, again, going back to that last chapter, is it that these children don't possess these abilities, or is it that the tasks that you designed specifically, some children struggle at? Preschoolers, symbolic thinking. So this is kind of a fun party trick if you're, I don't know, partying and there are children around. So preschoolers focus on perceptual salience, the most obvious features of an object. Young children are fooled by their perceptions. Conservation. Certain properties of an object or substance do not change when its appearance is altered in some superficial way. They're unable to engage in decentration, ability to focus on two or more dimensions. Pre-operational thinkers engage in centration, the tendency to center attention on a single aspect. All right, all that is in English is they children will, and I think looking at the figure to the right will help. If you present children with two equal glasses of water, and then you show a glass that is taller than the original glass, the child will believe that those liquids are no longer equal. And, kind of a bartender tip when pouring shots kind of thing. The same thing at the bottom of the line below that. Two equal lines of pennies, and then you increase the spacing of one of the pennies, and the child will believe that the increased space pennies are more pennies because of their inability to focus on multiple dimensions of the objects at once. Reversibility contributes to success on conservation tasks. The process of mentally undoing or reversing an action. Pour water from different shaped objects back into the original glass. Think it will overflow. So kind of like I was saying before, if you pour, for example, if the glass was like really tall, and then you instead used you had the experimenter pour the liquid into a very wide glass, the child would believe that the water is going to overflow, even though they're exact same amounts of water. However, as I kind of alluded to, little spoiler alert for you, cross-cultural experiments, children's specific experience can influence when they are able to conserve. Children of pottery makers in Mexican villages know that reshaping clay does not change the amount of clay at much younger ages in children who do not have similar experience. So this is the environment in the culture, which contains specific experiences and ideas within it, impacting this cognitive stage, as Piaget would characterize it. Children are watching their parents interact with clay. They know that this mold of clay is not, or just because it's been shaped into pottery, does not mean that the original mold of clay is smaller or larger than the new, whatever it was transformed into the vase or whatever. Now looking at Wojciechowski's sociocultural perspective, and I'm going to spend a little more time on Wojciechowski than typically textbooks do. I think that the emphasis on Piaget is actually pretty ethnocentric. He's an American researcher, and Wojciechowski has a completely different perspective on childhood development, and it's an important perspective and one that's gained a lot of influence internationally, but in the U.S. it's less emphasized than Piaget models. So I'm going to spend a decent amount of time or more time typically on Wojciechowski than typical textbooks. So Wojciechowski, he argued that culture and society play a pivotal role. Intelligence is held by the group. Intelligence doesn't just teach facts, it shapes how we think about the world generally. Former operational thought is rarely used in some cultures. The expected cognitive development to vary from society to society. Depends on the mental tools that the culture values and makes available. Children acquire mental tools by interacting with parents and other more experienced members of the culture. So that means that I mean, kind of what I have written here, but intelligence is held by the group. It's not Googling whatever. It's children learn through interactions with not just their parents, but their community members. And what they learn and what skills they learn is culturally based, which I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. But the tools that the mental tools that cultures pass down to children reflect the values that a culture emphasizes and the tasks that are required within a particular environment. So let's jump into some specifics here to hopefully clarify this. Social interaction and thought. Scaffolding. It's a learning mechanism in which parents provide initial assistance in children learning, but gradually remove structure as children become more competent. The zone of proximal development is the gap between what a learner can accomplish independently and what he or she can accomplish when the guidance and encouragement of a more skilled partner. So the idea here is like scaffolding, like construction, kind of a similar concept. The parent or the community, depending on the culture, provide children with kind of guardrails, kind of a training wheels situation where where the community, the caregiver, etc., uh, evaluates the skill level of the child, and based on that skill level, they put the child in a circumstance which is challenging but is able to be accomplished. And the caregiver is, either to the side or some, depends. Some are very close, some are more to the side, but theoretically there to provide assistance as a center of cultural knowledge so the child can complete the task or learn whatever it is they're trying to learn. Skills within the zone, skills at which instruction should be aimed, skills outside the zone, either well mastered or still too difficult. So the skills, going back to the zone of proximal development, it's the skills within the zones are skills that the caregiver has evaluated that a child is capable of learning. You don't want to give a 3-year old advanced calculus. It's a waste of time. They'll probably feel bad about themselves, or they just won't care. You don't want to also focus on zones outside the zone, again, because it could be too difficult or it could be too easy. So giving a 12-year-old 1 plus 1 problems all day, they'll probably just get pissed off and tired and bored, and they won't see a reason for this. So children can acquire skills and master tasks at different rates. There are no domain general stages. Children internalize the problem-solving techniques that are discovered through collaboration, eventually being able to use the techniques on their own. So what this is saying is that there is not just kind of a at 1 years old you learn this, 2 years old you're this ability, 3 years old you're this ability, because different cultures emphasize different mental tool, pass down different mental tools which emphasize different values and different skills. Children advance through sets of skills at different rates. Thus, there is no domain general. That is, that there's kind of this global advancement in a stage-like manner. And again, children solve problems and develop problem-solving techniques which are culturally relevant through working hand in hand with their caregivers, their elders, and then they eventually internalize those problem-solving techniques, which again, they eventually pass down to the next generation. The implications of proximal development. Knowledge is not a fixed state. No single test score can adequately reflect the range of a person's knowledge, and development consists of moving towards the upper range of a zone. A meta-analysis found that each year schooling adds 1 to 5 IQ points, demonstrates the concept of intelligence is wrapped up in particular kinds of cognitive skills through cultural learning. So the idea is that you just don't have this kind of flat IQ, and knowledge is not this fixed state. And that's evidence for that is that IQ raises 1 to 5 additional points per year of schooling. So it's kind of not this you're set in stone. This is your intelligence for life kind of thing. In development, contains a range of possible intellectual outcomes with the appropriate scaffolding allowing the child to meet the upper range of their developmental potential through guidance from knowledgeable centers of cultural information, that is elders, caregivers, etc. Cross-cultural evidence of Vygotsky's theory. How do people perform in taxonomic categorization, clustering items together using an abstract concept? So if I asked you which item doesn't belong, a hammer, a saw, a log, or a hatchet? Well, experimenters asked this, not Vygotsky, but a kind of a researcher who held similar ideas. He supported the social cultural theory of development. And you can see on the right-hand side that the participants were kind of confused for that. These are peasants in Uzbekistan. So looking kind of at just the participant responses, if you call 3 of them a hammer, there won't be right either. I saw a hammer and a hatchet all have to work together, but the log has to be here too. Probably he's got a lot of firewood, but he'll be left without firewood. We won't be able to do anything. It indicates a culture that emphasizes holistic reasoning. Objects are understood in terms of how they relate to the rest of the context. So you can see at the bottom, well, he's kind of trying to read into why it is that these objects are together. They're trying to think holistically. These objects are together for a reason that only the individuals within that context would understand. Versus kind of an American way of looking at this, we look at hammer, saw, hatchet, we would get rid of log, right? Because it's not a tool. But maybe that individual has a reason to have the log with the hatchet and the saw, right? Because maybe you have to just cut the log. So it's just kind of this larger contextual understanding, this holistic understanding, kind of going back again to this collective understanding that emphasizes literally our cognitive process, the way that we interpret the world, the way we categorize items in this case. So another example in rural Russia. You can see on the left-hand side, in the far north, all bears are white. Novoya Zemlya in the far north. What color are the bears in that part of that territory? And the answer from a Western point of view is, they're white. They're going to be white bears. But you ask these rural Russians in 1976, they replied kind of like what I said before. You should ask the person who have been there and seen them. That's because knowledge is about specific experiences that are passed down culturally through cultural transmission, through kind of like scaffolding. It's not about abstract concepts. So again, they cognitively process this information differently. They're reluctant to generalize beyond what they could tell from practical experience. At times, unwilling to accept the statements of in the syllogism. Similar reluctance and in groups in Liberia and in Mexico. It's not that they're unable to reason logically, but their reasoning is anchored to information with which they have direct experience and they think logically about that information. So it's not a logic issue here. It's that their culture has taught them to reason in a specific way, and it's logically appropriate to think in that particular way within their culture. They're capable of thinking the other way, but it makes no logical sense to them because it's what though that mental tool is not valued within that culture. Continuing on, Vygotsky believed that mental activity is mediated by tools. Adults use tools to pass culturally valued modes of thinking, so literally modes of thinking and problem-solving skills to their children. It's passed through spoken language, writing, and using numbers. The idea here, if a child wants to learn how to garden, we don't say go outside, okay, go do it. We give them tools and teach them best methods to accomplish that desired task. And imagine that in a rural setting where you depend on local farming and literally the entire community's nutrition and not starving to death depends on this child learning this information. What's the best way of making sure that the child knows what they're doing and doesn't kill the entire group? That's teaching them, that's scaffolding them, that's making sure that they develop to their full developmental potential by focusing on where they are in their zones of proximal development. And I always find this a fascinating example. The tools we use are the most recent product of many years, if not millennium, of accumulated cultural innovation, reflected in the speed of innovations. Archaeologists estimated that up until 100,000 years ago, major technological innovations appeared at the rate of about 0.0015 per thousand years. 40,000 years ago, the rate was 0.05. 12,000 years ago, 0.55. 9,000 years ago, which coincided with the birth of agriculture, the rate of change increased to about 5 innovations per thousand years. And now you see thousands of patents every single year. Some are garbage, but the point is that the humans have been able to pass down knowledge intergenerationally through kind of scaffolding processes. So they accumulate over time, and because each generation does not have to reinvent the wheel, that they're able to use knowledge from previous generations, which over time accelerates the rate by which we acquire new knowledge and have more create new inventions. Tools of thought. Language shapes thought. Thought changes fundamentally once we begin to think in words. Piaget argues that this is another example of egocentric nature of children. So again, Piaget arguing that this is the way thought changes within a child represents their egocentric nature. Preschool children use private speech to oneself that guides one's thought and behaviors, a critical step in the development of mature thought. Children talk to themselves in order to solve problems or clarify thoughts. Thinking out loud eventually becomes thought accompanied by internal speech, and talking to oneself becomes a practice only when engaged, when they're trying to learn something or remember something. So private thought, or private speech, I should say, kind of whispering to yourself, thinking something through. Piaget would say, oh, this is because the child is so focused on themselves, they're kind of just talking to themselves. While other theorists argue, no, this is actually a way for a child to practice the new skills that they learned and kind of talk through the different scenarios and problem solve. It's literally simulating these social circumstances, kind of similar to pretend play. And eventually, as stated on the final PowerPoint, it becomes that thought becomes internalized, and this is kind of common for adults too. If you're having an issue with something challenging, you're going to talk to yourself out loud, but otherwise, it's internalized thought. Heavy use contributes to effective problem-solving performance. When obstacles were placed in front of a child, their private speech increase. Novel tasks require more private speech than familiar ones. So there's evidence in studies. Researchers found that when a unfamiliar task is provided to a child, their private speech will go up. Again, they're trying to work through and apply the cultural teachings that they just learned. And eventually, as I stated before, this process becomes more inner speech, aka it becomes more internalized, more automatic. That cultural toolkit, that mode of thinking, that problem-solving set of skills. Use of private speech is associated with greater motivation toward mastery of goals, persistent on task without adult prodding. So they're more committed to the task. They've internalized it, they value it, and they want to succeed in it. Allows children to internalize the culturally acquired problem-solving strategies of adults, as I just stated. Evaluation of Vygotsky. Unfortunately, he died at 38 years old, did not have the length of life to develop the influence and research dossier that Piaget did. And also, it wasn't in English, and a lot of textbooks kind of use that as an excuse, but that was 70 years ago. I think we could translate, theory now. So, he died young. So he did not get to further develop his research and test it to the same extent that other researchers did. And measuring culture is difficult. It's hard having cross-cultural tasks. Measuring culture, not easy. It's far easier to administer a task in an undergraduate research setting. But so that is a limitation to Vygotsky. Okay, let's transition to attention, focusing on perception and cognition on something in particular, kind of a basic definition of attention. Orienting system, reacting to events in the environment, focusing system deliberately, seeks out and maintains attention to events. So just some basic definitions. Attention improvements, sustained attention is longer, so the ability to stay on task. These are kind of all things we understand about children, so they can focus, they can stay on task longer, their attention span's longer, they're more selective in what they attend to, better to plan out, carry out strategies, and it's believed that this is foundational self-regulation. So if I cannot pay attention to something, then I can't regulate. I can't focus on a task. I can't have a goal of listening to 400 hours of me rambling on about the psychology because I don't have that attention span. Even if I'm watching this on YouTube at 1.5 speed right now, I cannot regulate. I cannot meet my mastery goals. Selective attention, process of selecting one sensory channel and ignoring or minimizing others, deliberately concentrating on one thing while ignoring something else. It improves with age, and it depends on the complexity of the task. Children perform better with less distractions. Again, kind of stuff we all grew up knowing, that if you have TV on, you have a lot of noise, children have difficulty focusing on, whatever task they're working on, learning the alphabet. 3.5 years old, children 3.5 years old have trouble completing tasks with any level of distraction, and they improve with age. 4 years old have trouble with constant distractions. So selective attention improving with age. Any little distraction will make a younger children lose focus, but the older you get, the more distraction is more. It takes more distractions to divert your attention towards something that doesn't involve whatever it is you're working on. The constructive nature of memory. When remembering, we actively reconstruct memories, not passively, aka downloading exact copy off the internet. We reproduce them. patching together are often fuzzy recollections. So memory is not a kind of I upload it to my the OneDrive and then I just download. It's the same thing. We all know that. I'm not really sure if that happened. Or I kind of get the gist of it, which referring to the past chapter. When we remember yourself taking a walk, you see yourself as an observer would. Chinese are more likely than white Americans to see themselves at a distance in such memories. So when you imagine yourself going for a walk, you would focus more on yourself as an American, but specifically white Americans in general. Compared to other more collectivist cultures, again, distance, it's the horizon, it's the environment, because people are embedded within environments. It's not just kind of the individual driving the environment. The results fit with the finding that members of many Asian cultures are more likely than members of Western cultures to adopt others' perspectives. The information processing approach. It emphasizes basic mental processes, maturation of the nervous system, plus experience enables adults to remember more than young children. So kind of straightforward. Why children don't remember is because they cannot remember and they don't have the experience of remembering. Encoding. To encode material, we must first attend to it. Most events we experience are never encoded in the first place. Attention is role in memory. Next in line effect, teacher asks you to tell me a fun fact about yourself. Don't pay attention to the in front of you. Memory for common objects are never encoded. So much of memory is never actually encoded. So which on this nickel here, or sorry, this penny, what is it what is the correct penny? Most people would not, or many people, I should say, uh, won't remember because it's so common. There's no point of remembering it in the first place. And we don't focus on it. So in order to encode a memory, we have to pay attention to it. Information processing framework. Sensory memory slash sensory register, brief storage of perceptual information before it's passed down to short-term memory. Each sense has its own. It lasts, 1 to 10 seconds. Short-term memory lasts about 5 to 20 seconds, similar to working memory. It's memory that it just holds it for a limited amount of time. And long-term memory, believed to be relatively permanent and seemingly unlimited storage of information capabilities. So kind of straightforward here. So short is short, long is long. Sensory is that each sense has kind of a memory, and it's some of it's not passed down or passed to your working memory, your short-term memory, but others are, and each sense has some or has the capability of passing down or passing up, whatever, however you want to figuratively say this, passing along memory to, or that sensory information to short-term memory. Types of memory with retrieval, recognition, and recall. Retrieval, the process of getting information out when it's needed. Often doesn't match what we originally put into it. So like I said before, memories are not uploaded to OneDrive and you download it. It's reconstructed. And sometimes memories are actually, we have the memory, but we're unable to reach it. We're unable to retrieve it towards ourselves and bring it to our focus. Recognition memory is kind of the multiple choice test, for example, selecting previously remembered information from an array of options. Typically easier than recall memory, which is generating previously remembered information. Requires active retrieval without any aid of cues. So when did Florida become an American state? So it's kind of a trivia question. It's a question where you don't have any cues at all. You don't have multiple choice. So of executive function, and there'll be a video within the PowerPoints if you want to check it out. Refers to the self-regulatory processes such as the ability to inhibit behavior. And the point of this, so basically the point of this is that it's a self-regulatory process to achieve a specific goal and is related to development in the prefrontal cortex, which develops experiences influence the development of the prefrontal cortex and thus executive function skills. It consists of 3 components: working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. Working memory is basically short-term memory, a little different, but good enough for this class. Inhibition, similar to Simon Says, you got to inhibit a behavior. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between mental states, sets of rules, or tasks. The idea here is that it's kind of like inhibition, but it's a little more complex. So if you imagine a child going to recess, and obviously at recess there's a whole bunch of different rules. You know, you kickball, whatever, play dodgeball, run around, scream. Then the child is called back in from recess, and now it's in a classroom setting, and obviously there are a whole different set of rules, like don't run around, don't throw, or don't kick the kickball, don't play dodgeball. So this kind of this shift, this flexibility in a child's uh, regulatory behavior to switch from multiple sets of rules, tasks, and mental states in one setting from another. Like many cognitive changes, brain maturation, especially the prefrontal cortex, long experience influence development executive function. And on the video is actually the a video of children in Democratic Republic of Congo uh, being administered a what is that? It's a cognitive flexibility test, I believe, because there's a working memory test and a cognitive flexibility test. But basically, they're asked to put the yellow blocks in the blue bucket and the blue blocks in the yellow bucket. So kind of a new set of rules, and it tests cognitive flexibility. This is from my dissertation. So I wanted to review kind of how ACEs or how challenging circumstances harm executive function development, and also how there's certain buffers, certain protective factors that can lessen the harm of potential uh, negative effects on kind of outcomes, in this case, executive function. So kind of just outlined a few of those in red pen. The quality of observed parent-child interactions was related to fewer child symptoms, congruent with a promotive role. Cumulative adversity, aka ACEs, was related to total problem score, so kind of some external problem behaviors. Um, and parenting quality was generally associated with better child executive functioning. So the idea here is that even among homeless children, in very challenging circumstances for the parent and the children, the children are still protected from some of the negative effects, not all of it, of homelessness through positive parent-child interactions. In cross-cultural executive function study and kind of whatever, this is my study, but I'm breaking out Piaget, egocentric over here. So I found that maternal early life stress, that is maternal ACEs, related to offspring executive function development. And why that is the case can be a lot of reasons. It could be uh, the biological programming of moms in this case prior to becoming pregnant. It could be related to parent-child interactions. It could be related to certain family dynamics, um, presumably fathers who are also similarly stressed out, collectively resulting in uh, children performing worse on child executive function tasks. So consolidation and storage, they stabilize and facilitate long-term storage. Memory is facilitated by sleep. So from the last chapter or chapter two, I don't remember, I talked about rats being, when they're stripped of REM sleep, their hippocampus the volume in their hippocampus decreases, which is associated with memory. And then stress is obviously is harmful. It negatively impacts memory. Storage process of keeping information in memory. Constructive process is not a static recording. So exactly what we were saying before, memory is reconstructed. Autobiographical memories, episodic specific memories of personal events, important of understanding who we are. So we develop a narrative. Who am I as a person? These are autobiographical memories. They're specific memories about personal events. Moving on to developing a theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to think about other people's thoughts, understandings that people have mental states such as desires, beliefs, and intentions, and that these mental states guide their behavior. A false belief test assesses the understanding that people can hold incorrect beliefs. These beliefs, even though incorrect, can influence their behavior. So most people, so theory of mind is again kind of the ability to understand that other people have thoughts. It's kind of moving on from egocentrism line of thinking. Most people test this through false belief task, but it's false belief task is only one concept of theory of mind, and it generally gets like conflated that this is theory of mind. But anyway, the point of this is this Sally, and I don't remember what the other one, Sally Sue task or something like that. So you ask a child you present a scenario to a child where Sally leaves a toy in a basket and then walks away. Then while Sally is away, Sue moves the toy from the basket to, I don't know, under the couch. And then they ask the child, where does Sally believe that the toy is? And obviously, the Sally should think that the toy is where she left it. But children at this age, it's argued, they will know because they know that the toy got moved to under the bed, that they just because they know it, they infer that Sally knows it. So even though Sally left it in, one particular location, the child will believe that Sally will know it's in a new location because they personally know that. That's the idea behind false belief. It's a false belief of where the toy is. Now, textbooks generally present the theory of mind as really the static concept and that's been settled, but it's hardly settled. And it's always discouraging for me to see theory of mind presented in a particular way, where theory of mind is just false belief understanding, and that some children are unable to uh, successfully perform well on that task. 85% of 4-year-olds passed the false belief test. 80% of the children with autism failed. Children with autism may display social deficits because they lack a theory of mind. They have mind blindness. So this is an argument that is very common among theory of mind, that autistic children are unable to successfully complete they don't possess theory of mind. They are mind blind. And they are mind blind because they're unable to perform well on a series of theory of mind tasks, and typically the false belief task, the Sally Sue, whatever it is, Sally whoever task. But numerous articles have found that there are empirical failures of the claim that autistic people lack a theory of mind. These results are not always replicated, so it's far from settled science, but it's consistently presented that way. And I have a link in the there's a link in the description if you want to check out that article. Now, I want to present a theory that's typically not discussed in textbooks at all, dealing with theory of mind. And this theory is called the double empathy problem. It was developed by an autistic researcher from the UK, Damien Milton. And, he got tired of mind blind. There's a lot, saying that if theory of mind is the ability to perceive that other people exist, have emotions, that it's kind of empathy, that's rooted in this double empathy problem, that it's kind of an ability to be human, and you're saying that autistic children lack that ability. It's pretty demeaning. It's I think it's obviously has a lot of ableist implications, and it's kind of it makes you question the humanity of autistic children in this example. So Milton argued that his theory of double empathy problem suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they will struggle to empathize with each other. This is likely to be exacerbated through differences in language use and comprehension. So we all have many of us have experiences where we're trying to communicate with somebody who English is their first language, their second language, or doesn't speak it at all. And there's difficulties communicating, and at times where you can get frustrated, and then you have a lack of empathy for that individual. Well, it's kind of similar here. It's that autistic people are experiencing the world in a particular way that non-autistic individuals are unfamiliar with. So they create a empathy problem between the two sides. And if this is kind of very similar to Vygotsky's theory, you're experiencing the world in certain ways, you're acquiring certain modes of thinking, and you're acquiring certain problem-solving skills. Recent research has found that in experimental conditions, non-autistic people struggle to read the emotions of autistic participants or form negative first impressions of autistic people. Such evidence would suggest that the dominant psychological theories of autism are partial explanations at best. So Milton is arguing that his studies and similar studies who support this theory, that it's not just that autistic people lack or have mind blindness, it's that when an autistic individual is performing a task, whatever, in this experiment, non-autistic people are unable to understand the emotions and what it is that the non-autistic individual is trying to accomplish. So it's not that, it would be the same concept. Imagine it in reverse, that an autistic person is unable to read the emotions of non-autistic participants. According to the mind blindness theory, we would suggest that, oh, they have no theory of mind. But this research provides evidence for the case that it's actually an empathy problem, a double empathy problem, rooted in the ability to understand the different cognitive processes by which people interpret the world and the different experiences that they experience within the world. So continuing on the double empathy problem, this image here is from a kind of a pamphlet or a little small book, webpage, designed by Milton uh, to kind of explain to children. It's a children's pamphlet, the communication difficulties and why they're occurring among autistic children and non-autistic children. So according to the theory, these issues are not due to autistic cognition alone, but a breakdown of reciprocity and mutual understanding that can happen between people with very differing ways of experiencing the world. And just kind of looking at the left side, they may struggle to read between the lines, overcome other people's misconceptions about autism, manage sensory distractions. May struggle to recognize and understand autism, imagine autistic sensory difficulty. So both parties are struggling to understand each other's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and differences. That's the crux of this argument. This theory would suggest that those with similar experiences are more likely to form connections and a level of understanding, which has ramifications in regard to autistic people being able to meet one another. So again, kind of similar to really Vygotsky, it's these shared experiences that allow us to understand each other and have empathy and develop mutual problem-solving skills. And finally, just one more study, autism and the double empathy problem, implications for developmental health. So again, imagine you're an autistic individual and you are told that you have mind blindness. You have literally a blindness towards blindness implies that you don't have it. You do not have the ability to perceive other people's emotions as a human being. The internalizing that, what can that do? Well, some researchers have tried to examine this. And these researchers argued that this framework has harmful effects on mental health for autistic individuals, and it prevents them from reaching their full cognitive potential. Again, similar to Vygotsky, our zones of proximal development, or reaching, not exactly the same, but reaching our full developmental potential. In the case of an autistic individual, not being able to reach that full developmental potential due to the internalization of kind of subhumanity in some regards. So Wellman proposed children's theory of mind develops in two phases. Doesn't matter who Wellman is, a researcher. There's desire psychology and belief desire. Desires, I want that thing. They explain their own behavior and that of others in terms of wants and desires. Belief desire psychology, they understand that people do what they do because they desire certain things and believe that certain actions will help them fulfill their desires. So kind of the definition is embedded in the terms. Late elementary school, children grasp that different minds construct different realities. These interpretations of events are influenced by these views. So again, I have an understanding that you exist as an individual and it's not just about me. It's not about me. I am not in that other case of uh, social blindness. I don't have that social blindness that it's just me and my perception. I know that other humans exist. Developing a theory of mind, chimpanzees, gorillas, and other great apes share with humans some basic theory of mind skills. Developing a theory of mind requires a certain level of neurological and cognitive maturations. Mirror neurons evolved in theory of mind, neurons that are activated both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else. Some mirrors argue that there is no mirror neuron system. So just kind of there's evidence in other primate species that theory of mind exists. And their mind is related to certain cognitive developments. A 1 day-old baby is probably not capable of understanding the complexities of other people's beliefs. And mirror neurons were one proposed neural mechanism by which theory of mind is manifested behaviorally, but other researchers, and there's decent evidence that there is, real solid evidence, I should say, that there is no mirror neuron system, and it's a vast simplification, but it's in the textbook, so I'm presenting you with that information. Anyway, the vocabulary spurt, a spurt where a pace of word learning quickens dramatically. At 8 months old, a hypothesized increase from 50 words at 18 months to 150 words at 20 months to 300 words. So rapidly, children are rapidly developing during this time. It's, there's this spurt associated with vocabulary learning. Fast mapping, capacity of children learners to readily determine the object. Okay, use sense context to help make an educated guess. Okay, so the idea here is that you're listening to your parent, your caregiver give, talk to you. And just based on other words, based on the social context, the social circumstances, you're able to piece together what words mean. I put this slide back into chapter 3 as well. It's the same slide we already had in chapter 2, so I'm not going to review it. But that's kind of the nature of this book, that certain concepts are repeated. So continuing on with that word gaps information, there's a seminal study that found that children from the wealthiest families heard more than 3 times the number of words per hour than poor children, 620 per hour versus 2,000 words. Found that children who heard more words as they grew up entered the school with larger vocabularies and a higher IQ test. So this is kind of like a seminal study that people talk about with trying to figure out why it is that poor children have worse educational outcomes than rich children. Obviously, I'm sure many reasons why come to your mind, but for these people, they argue that, oh, it's the amount of words being spoken in a rich home. However, follow-up research found that it's not the quantity of words that is most important, but the quality of words. So I could just list words all day in incoherent fashion, small words that are not really providing any information to a child. Um, that is not as valuable as quality, ultimately conversations, child-directed speech. Having interactions with your child is most important. Expanding language skills. Bilingualism. Middle childhood brings increased meta-awareness, meta-linguistic awareness, knowledge of language as a system. Children use meta-linguistic skills, understand the concept of words and can define words. Children can distinguish between grammatically incorrect. So the idea is I know the structure of language, I know how my language works, and I can meta look at it and correct myself and distinguish between correct and grammatically incorrect sentences. Bilingual children have better meta-linguistic skills. Bilingual and multilingual infants remain sensitive to a wider range of sounds, may experience a temporary delay. So if you remember from last chapter that as children age, they become increasingly sensitive to sounds that are common in their language. But bilingual children, multilingual children, they show increased sensitivity for more sounds even outside their original first language. And bilingualism and multilingualism is associated with all kinds of positive outcomes that I'll get to in a second. But you may see some small temporary delays in some developmental areas, but you see rapid cognitive catch up because really what you're doing is you're spending more time on kind of like a foundation, and then you explode from there. Well, other people kind of have their foundation set, they have their language, and then they immediately start developing other other cognitive skills related to that language. So other accounts of bilingual children alters the neural connections of the brain, and this isn't exactly neurologically correct, but it's fine for the purpose of this class. Basically, the idea is you learn multiple languages, and you're able to switch back and forth between the languages that you're using, and in fact, your brain is processing both languages at the exact same time, which may relate to your ability to switch between different tasks, so that cognitive flexibility. Uh, Executive function component that I alluded to earlier. Increases working memory and ability to ignore irrelevant information, strengthens executive function components. Learning a second language later in life results in different changes in the brain. So kind of going back to that language development from last chapter, where there's a sensitive period of language, we obviously have examples though of adults learning a language past, whatever 1 to 5 years old, 1 to 8 years old, whatever the proposed sensitive time is, or the sensitive period is. But interestingly, the neural activation of when you're talking in your second language is different depending on when you learned your second language. Early education. Researchers dispute the idea that typically developing children raised in typically family environments need direct instructions during the first 3 years of life. So all this kind of, you'll see all these apps, baby Einstein, baby Mozart, kind of how to, especially in the US context, I can't speak for every context, but this idea that I've got to have the genius baby and every little thing is a marker of their future cognitive potential, and I gotta drill them to make them be future Einsteins at 1 years old. Well, one issue researchers argue is that this may not give children enough time to play and socialize as they choose important activities for development. So, like we found out, symbolic representation, pretend play, having imaginary friends are all important uh, features of development. They aid with social development. They aid with cognitive development. And ironically, by stripping children that playtime can actually harm development. Studies of babies watching educational videos for each hour spent watching videos, babies understood 6 to 8 fewer words. So the idea here is I'm gonna put my kid in front of YouTube and they're gonna learn, whatever. Well, some studies have argued not only most studies find that you're not gonna learn anything, but a lot of also other studies have found that in fact you're doing harm. Children are learning. It's having a negative effect on their learning their cognitive abilities. Studies on educational preschool programs with a strong academic commitment, initial advantage in basic academic skills, less creative, more anxious in testing situations, and more negative towards school than social in preschool. So the idea here is I enroll my child at a preschool that's just drilling. Well, there are negative repercussions for this. And one of those, the book to the left actually talks a lot about this. The price of privilege, how parental pressure and material advantage are creating a generation of disconnected and happy kids. So this emphasis on drilling at a very young age, harming the social outcomes of children, making them more anxious, making them feel more negative towards school, making them less creative because they don't have the opportunity to participate in that imaginary play, the symbolic thinking. Just play is very important towards development, and that's often ignored by many of these approaches to development. So the National Association for the Education of Young Children created kind of 10 standards for school. I'm not going to read these, but the idea is that the collaborative relationships are formed, teachers know what they're doing, and multiple areas of development are emphasized within these preschool programs. Now, looking at Head Start. Head Start promotes school readiness of infants, toddlers, and preschool age children from low-income families. A study found that 3 and 4-year-old children in Head Start received a potentially positive effect on general reading, but not on math. Early intervention produced short-term increases in IQ. Although most experiments are poorly designed and which is difficult because it's difficult to design quality studies in a preschool location. People drop in and out, especially low incomes. People don't attend studies, don't come back, etc. But it's pretty. A lot of research finds that Head Start is not related to long-term developmental, or at least academic achievements. And why do you think that might be? We talked about the accumulation of stress, those larger systems impacting child, those doses, those duration effects. So the idea here is really a 1 year program supposed to be able, and not even a year program for most of these individuals, is that supposed to offer protective factors for the rest of their life? Is it fair to say Head Start should be a protective factor throughout the lifespan of a child? I think fair questions to ask. No, I went into a lot about autism in the previous slides, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But autism spectrum disorder usually begins in infancy, characterized by abnormal social and communication development and restricted interest and repetitive behavior. So two features of autism according to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is used to diagnose individuals with a wide variety of conditions. One is social and communication deficits, and the other is restrictive and repetitive interest and behavior. Seek sameness and repetition, and resist change. ASD diagnosis includes autism, child integrative disorder, and Asperger's syndrome. So DSM has grouped these together. So there's not a difference between autism and Asperger's within the DSM-5. Suspected causes, not bad parenting. It could be genes, again, complicated, whatever that means. Environmental triggers could interact with genetic predispositions, such as viruses or chemicals in the environment. And most importantly, out of all this, vaccines do not cause autism. As MMR vaccines in America, European and Japan stagnated rates of autism diagnosis continue to rise. So the idea that MMR vaccines are what is causing autism is impossible because they, as those rates of vaccines stagnated, so stood flat, rates of autism cross-culturally went up. So there cannot be a correlation. That is not causal. Moreover, even when after the Danish government stopped administering thimerosal containing vaccines, the prevalence of autism still skyrocketed. So the kind of the theoretical, based on wild speculation, no reason for vaccines being related to autism, even when that is held constant, removed from the equation in a cross-cultural setting, autism rates still went up. This is what is known as an illusionary correlation. Just because two things occur around the same time does not mean they cause each other. Many things happen at the same time. That does not mean they cause each other. Psychosocial development in early childhood. Now let's jump into another Erickson stage here. Initiation versus guilt, and we touched on all the stages, the crises that an individual must go through. Trust and autonomy of previous stages develop into a desire to take initiative and think of ideas and initiate action. They develop a sense of purpose by devising bold plans. They said, I did it. As you have seen, preschoolers define themselves in terms of their physical activities and accomplishments. So this is just a pretty straightforward initiative. They want to initiate action. They have ideas, they have plans, and they take great pride in things. Concepts of personality. We have self-concept, which is what I am. Self-esteem, how good am I? And identity, the overall sense of who we are, who they are, where they are heading, and where they fit into society. The emerging self. Infants may be born without a sense of self. Develops based on their perceptions of their bodies and actions, grows out of their interaction with caregivers. Their rise capacity to develop to differentiate self from the world is at 2 to 3 months of age. At 18 months, infants recognize themselves in a mirror. Babies also form categorized self by 18 to 24 months. Classifies selves into social categories based on age, self, and other visible external characteristics. So kind of the idea here is just that infants they don't understand that they are unique self, like literally do not understand that, but they slowly understand that a self exists and they are self, and they can recognize um, themselves as distinct from somebody else. Self-control, response inhibition, ability to not initiate behavior before you have evaluated all the info, response initiation, ability to stop a behavior, delayed gratification, ability to hold out for a larger reward. Self-control is seen in early adulthood. As executive function improves, children become less impulsive. So the famous marshmallow test, the a video of it is in the description, but I mean you can look it up anywhere. The idea is that marshmallow is presented to a child. The child is told, if you do not eat this marshmallow right now, I'll give you 50 marshmallows when I return. All you have to do is not eat the marshmallow. And depending on the age of the child, the younger they are, the more likely they are to eat the marshmallow because they are unable to delay gratification. They lack that ability of self-control. Moving on to sex and gender, we have biological sex, physical characteristics that define male and female, and gender, the cultural, social, and psychological meaning associated with masculinity and femininity. Psychological characteristics include behaviors, thoughts, emotions, and sense of self, incorporated features that society associates with men and women. So pretty straightforward. Biological sex, physical characteristics that define male and female. Gender is culturally based. It's historically based. It's a set of behaviors that change with time, um, um, and depending on what country you're in, that define what is proper gender behavior. So sex and gender roles, patterns of behavior that females and males should adopt. It's kind of generally known as a colloquial word. Gender role norms, society's expectations and standards concerning what males and females should be like. Gender stereotypes, overgeneralized, largely inaccurate views. Many originate from grain of truth. Uh, Studies have found that men and women describe themselves more similarly in the 90s than men and women in the 70s. So again, back to the historical period. All these are a lot of these concepts are historically based, and they reflect the economics, the politics, the social conditions of the time. As women, for a lot of reasons, we stop preventing them from participating in certain roles in society, and due to kind of income stagnation and the necessity of having two-person households where both parents work change the gender stereotypes and change the gender roles within society. Again, these are not set in stone. They're not biologically based. They're socially and culturally determined. But as stated, there is obviously a grain of truth to gender stereotypes, and that's because we pass to children certain cultural knowledge. And one way we do that is through differential treatment. Differences between males and females at birth are small and inconsistent. Male newborns tend to be somewhat more irritable. Females are more alert than males, but really small differences. Parents tend to use masculine terms for newborn uh, boys, and girls, infants likely to be labeled as sugar or sweetie. So, just one way by which that kids adapt these gender norms. A boy kicks something and they comment how big and strong they are, and a girl could be doing the same behavior and they can say, "Oh, that's so nice, sweetie." So continuing on, study on gender stereotyping. Students watch videos of infant introduced as Dana or David, interpreted strong reaction to Jack in the Box, interpreted strong reaction to toy as fear when introduced as Diana. So in this experiment, they put this child in front of a Jack in the Box, and they just told the parents, just random parents, what is this child? Describe this child's emotions. And this child's name is Dana, or this child is David. If a parent is told that the child's name is Dana, they'll describe the reaction to the Jack in the Box as fear. But when they are told that the child's name is David, the parents are more likely to describe the same exact emotion, because this is literally the same video, as anger. Early learning. By 18 months, most toddlers seem to have an emerging understanding that they are either like or other males or females. Girls as young as 24 months understand which activities are associated with males and which are females. Boys do not show the same understanding until 6 months later. So it's kind of an interesting finding. So it seems that gender roles in females are taught more, there's more emphasis on that for young girls than young boys. By age 2.5 to 3 years of age, most children give verbal proof of identity awareness that they're either a boy or a girl. So you can ask a child and they will tell you what gender they believe or what gender they are. So let's look at some theories of gender role development. Specifically, we'll start with the social learning theory, and there's two components of this I want to look at. But social learning theory argues that behavior is learned through observation, modeling, reinforcement, and punishment, and that's how children learn their identities and their preferences. And we're going to look at differential reinforcement and observational learning. The gender role development: which behaviors do people enforce or punish? What sorts of social models are available in a particular culture in a particular historical time? Differential reinforcement. Children are rewarded for sex-appropriate behaviors, punished for behaviors considered more appropriate for members of the other sex. Sons under average are more spanked than daughters. So kind of one way of reinforcement for young boys is through punishment, through spanking. By second year of life, parents discourage cross-sex play. Parents who show the clearest patterns of differential reinforcement have children who are relatively quick to label themselves as boys or girls. So the more reinforcement of gender stereotypes, the more likely and how rapid the child internalize those gender roles varies based on the degree to which reinforcement is administered to the children, which makes sense. The more you parent a certain thing, the more rapidly a child will internalize those values. Fathers tend to explicitly express gender stereotypes, and mothers provide more implicit stereotypes. Throw away a math camp brochure for daughters. So different strategies for reinforcing genders. So looking at differential reinforcement, children are rewarded for sex-appropriate behaviors, punished for behaviors considered more appropriate for members of the other sex. So parents will spank their sons more on average. So that's a big time way that the sex-appropriate behaviors as defined by parents and their particular group or culture enforces sex-appropriate behaviors. By second year of life, parents discourage cross-sex play, and the clearest patterns of differential reinforcement have children who are relatively quick to label themselves. So kind of straightforward. The more that parents differentially reinforce based on sex-appropriate behaviors as defined by them, the quicker the child will internalize those behaviors. Fathers tend to explicitly express gender stereotypes, while mothers provide more implicit stereotypes. So two different types or methods by which to enforce gender stereotypes. Looking at observational learning, children see which toys and activities are for girls and which are for boys. They imitate individuals of their own sex. They learn from the media. Children who see their mothers perform agentic tasks, and their fathers perform household child care tasks tend to be less aware of gender stereotypes. Boys with girls with sisters and girls with brothers have less gendered types. God damn, look at that. Oh, now looking at differential reinforcement, children are rewarded for sex-appropriate behaviors. Sons on average are more spanked than daughters. So that's one method by which reinforcement is administered to boys. By second year of life, parents discourage cross-sex play. So the idea here is, and it's pretty self-explanatory, that the more parents emphasize what they believe are sex-appropriate behaviors, the more quickly the quicker the child will adopt those gender stereotypes. Fathers provide explicit gender stereotypes, while mothers provide more implicit stereotypes. So just two different modes by which parents pass on gender stereotypes to their children. Now, looking at observational learning, children see which toys and activities are for girls and which are for boys when just interacting with the world. They imitate individuals of their own sex. They learn from the media, and children who see their mothers perform agentic tasks and their fathers perform household slash child care tasks tend to be less aware of gender stereotypes and less gendered than children exposed to traditional. Boys with sisters and girls with brothers as well as uh, gender type activity preferences than children who grow up with same-sex siblings. So pretty straightforward. The household, spoiler, your family has an impact on your development. If you see if your mother, whatever, is accountant or something, when your dad is more focusing on whatever household chores, or if you're like Meet the Parents and you have a male nurse as a dad, then you're going to develop less traditional gender stereotypes because that's literally all you know. And the same thing with interacting with your siblings. You interact with your brothers, your sisters as a male or female. You're going to do more, by definition, uh, cross sex play, which affects your development. So, looking at self-fulfilling prophecies, parents influenced by societal stereotypes about gender differences in ability expect their sons to outperform their daughters in math. So, the parents, they're not just making this up, they believe it. They've been influenced by, the culture they live in, which is obviously expected. They expect their sons to perform better than their daughters in math. And when daughters do outperform or, perform well on math, they credit that performance to their daughter's hard work versus, more of their son's kind of like innate ability. Fathers use more scientific terms and provide more detailed explanations to their sons than with daughters. Children begin to internalize their parents' views. Girls report they are less confident and more anxious about performance than boys. Thinking they lack ability, girls become less interested in math. So that's one mechanism by which gender stereotypes affect the long-term outcomes and career choices of children. Of course, these outcomes are historically based, and they're seeing differences today in the careers that women and boys and men choose for a host of reasons. So schema theory. Children are intrinsically motivated to acquire values, interests, and behavior consistent with cognitive judgments about themselves. Self-socialization begins as soon as children acquire a basic gender identity. Children acquire gender schemas, organized sets of beliefs, use in-group, out-groups. So kind of this argument is that I adopt the fact that I am a boy, and therefore there are certain values, interests that means to be a boy. So therefore, I have to, behave in a way that's consistent with my beliefs on what it means to be a boy, or I'm, violating some internal consistency. So the chart is kind of useful here as a little flow chart. So kind of continuing on with this schema theory. A young girl knows that her basic gender identity might first learn that sewing is for girls and building planes is for boys. Because she's a girl, she wants to act consistently with her own gender, largely ignores any information that comes her way about how to build model airplanes. So kind of a self-selection process by which children who adopt these gender theories live their life, and that affects, long-term outcomes, obviously. Transgender, identifying with gender opposite of their natal sex. Cisgender is those whose sex and gender assigned at birth match. Gender dysphoria is distress accompanying a mismatch between one's gender identity and biological sex. So much of the hullabaloo about transgender people is really not understanding basic definitions and kind of the role of history and cultures and defining what gender is. Longitudinal study following 300 socially transitioned transgender children between the ages of 3 and 12. So longitudinal, that means they followed them from 3 to 12 years old. Socially transitioned transgender children identified with the gender opposite than the one assigned at birth, and they changed their appearance and pronouns to reflect their gender identity. So basically, by a longitudinal research, you can follow when children begin to identify with the opposite gender and kind of when they kind of socialize as transgender individuals. And I'm going to get to that in a couple slides, actually. Intersex, born with either an absence of some combination of male and female reproductive organs, sex hormones, or sex chromosomes, about 2% of the world's population. There are dozens of intersex conditions and intersex individuals. Turner syndrome, with absence or imperfect second X chromosome, genetic disorder caused by increased production of androgens, androgen insensitivity syndrome, when a person has one X and one Y chromosome, but is resistant to male hormones and androgens. So sex, more complicated than male, female. There are dozens of documented intersex conditions that exist within medical research. So stages of transgender identity, pre-coming out, exploration, intimacy, identity integration. There's no one single path and it depends on the social and economic circumstances of an individual. Should be pretty straightforward. It also depends on the historical moment. Is it dangerous for me to come out? Am I literally going to be killed? If I come out, will I get fired from my job, etc.? So I'm just going to look at two stages right now because that's where, we're still early in this young little child's life that we're following. We're going to look at pre-coming out, which is children feel confused as they realize they do not fit into the two genders categories, and coming out, begin to acquire to selves and others they do not fit the standard gender identities and can occur across the lifespan. Studies show that transgender adults acknowledge feeling different from others as a child. So even if you ask these individuals as an adult, hey, how did you feel as a child? And they consistently self-report that they felt different, that their sex did not match their gender. And we'll return to this in future chapters. So let's look at parenting styles now. There's two dimensions of parenting: parental acceptance / responsiveness, and demanding controlness. So acceptance is warm, supportive. Demanding control, how much control over decisions lies with the parents, as opposed to with the child. They set rules, they expect children to follow the rules, and they mother their children for compliance. Now looking at parenting styles, we have authoritarian parenting and authoritative parenting. There's actually 4 styles, which you can see on the right-hand side, and we're going to kind of briefly review all of these. Authoritarian parenting is restrictive parenting. Pretty straightforward. It's authoritarian, high demanding, and low acceptance. Parents impose many rules, they expect obedience, and they rely on power assertion tactics. Authoritative is more flexible, demanding, and sensitive to the child. They set clear rules. They consistently enforce the rules, but they have a rationale for rules. It's not that just I'm God, listen to me. And they're responsive to the children's needs / points of view. Now, moving on to permissive parenting and neglectful parenting. Permissive parenting, sometimes referred to as indulgent parenting, it's high acceptance, low demand, pretty straightforward. I'm just giving you permission to do whatever the hell you want. It's child-centered, relatively few rules, and make relatively few demands. If for those watching Teen Mom 2, maybe Chelsea's dad, little permissive parenting. Neglectful parenting, disengaged, uninvolved parenting. Low demand, low acceptance, neglect. It's low in everything. Hostile or rejecting or indifferent, overwhelmed by their own problems. So they have so many issues going on in their own life that they're unable to parent in a way that increases or that allows a child to fulfill their developmental potential. So parenting style, child outcomes. Children of permissive parents often are impulsive, aggressive, self-centered, aimless, and lowly independence. I'm not that mad at you, Chelsea. It's your parenting style. I think you overcame a little bit. I'm only on season 5. Had little opportunity to learn self-reliance and lacked confidence in their own decision making. So kind of the idea here is because they're so dependent on their parents and have so little rules that they act impulsively, and they really don't have that sense that confidence that they can accomplish anything. The worst developmental outcomes, however, are associated with neglectful and undeveloped parenting. So there are cases where all these parenting styles may be needed. If um, you're being bombed or whatever, you might need to authoritarian rules because, hey, kid, don't go outside and play in the landmines and etc. So, it's culturally and historically, those cultural and historical factors impact the appropriateness of the parenting style. And the effectiveness of different parenting approaches can differ depending on the culture or subculture context in which they are used. Depends on how common parenting style is. So this is already, we covered this again in the previous chapter, but again, it's relevant. It's kind of a feature of this book is they'll bring up the same topic, multiple chapters. And so I'm going to highlight it again. I'm not going to go over it though. So spanking, a longitudinal study that followed more than 1,500 families from 20 U.S. cities and looked at parents' reports of spanking were assessed at ages 3 and 5. Measures of external behavior and receptive vocabulary were assessed at age 9. Results indicated that the children who were spanked at least twice a week by their mothers scored 2.66 points higher on measures of aggression and rule breaking than those who were never spanked. Those who were spanked less still scored 1.17 points higher than those never spanked. When fathers did the spanking, those spanked at least twice per week scored 5.7 points lower on vocabulary tests. So basically, spanking decreased receptive vocabulary and increased aggressive behaviors, and this operates on a continuum. The more spanking, the worse outcomes for these children. Sibling relationships. The arrival of a new sibling can be a wild time for for young children. It can temporarily decrease in children's affection for and responsiveness to their mothers because mothers and their fathers and their family are you know the new infant requires more attention, more resources. Entry of a new family member perturbs the family system. Most firstborns seek interest in and adapt well to a new sibling, while minority have difficulty coping. So don't worry. Over time, and generally pretty quickly, the older child will adapt to the new child. Adjust to a new sibling is easier if the parents' relationship is good and remains good after the birth. The firstborn has a secure relationship, and both parents have good mental health and confidence in their parenting. Sibling influences on development. So, four functions of siblings: emotional support, caregiving, teaching, and social experience. So, all of these have, so having a sibling is developmentally very positive, as long as you have a horrible relationship. But however, if you do have a horrible relationship, a negative over sibling can set in motion a negative chain of events of influence in the family system. So, if you imagine the meso system and from Bronfenbrenner, how we there's within that system are family dynamics and a negative child or a child maybe who's getting in trouble. Imagine a child who's getting into a lot of trouble and maybe it puts a strain on the marriage, which then harms the development of the other child. And you see, and then maybe there's a divorce, and maybe there's loss of income, et cetera, et cetera. And we're kind of, domino effect, cascading effect is generally how it's referred to in developmental psychology. So play, I hope I emphasize enough that play is important for development, and play changes as children develop. Two changes in play between infancy and age 5, they become more social and more imaginative. So this researcher argued for categories of play, and basically play goes from less social to much more social. So in the beginning, child plays alone, all the way to the end where they're cooperatively playing. Children join forces to achieve a common goal. They act as a pair, and they collaborate on a drawing. Versus in the same scenario, a child giving two pieces of paper to two children, they'll just sit there quietly and draw by themselves. So you become more social. And this is just a chart of the types of play and how they change with age. Again, I don't need the specific percentages when you're studying for this, just kind of the general idea of how play progresses. So looking at continuing with play, pretend play in which one actor, object, or action symbolizes or stands in for another. At age 1, first pretend play. At school age, playing organized games with rules. So you go from kind of symbolic play, which is very important, but increasingly it's more social and it's more rule based. And at least in U.S. settings, these groups will develop where there's kind of hierarchies, where there's followers and there are leaders. But developmental trajectories and the exact dynamics of these groups differ across cultures. What good is play? Play is associated with all kinds of good cognitive outcomes. Physical play is associated with neuromaturation of uh, the motor areas associated with motor skills within the brain. It contributes to healthy emotional development by providing opportunities to act out or express bothersome feelings. So kids having some issues, go run it off, go run a mile, kid. That's you send these kids to PE for a lot of reasons, developmentally and as a kind of a buffer from problem behaviors. Implications of early attachment on childcare. So, a study from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development found that infants who received routine care by someone other than their mothers were no less securely attached to their mothers. Quality of parenting was a much stronger influence on attachment than the daycare experience. Quality of daycare matters. Very simple. If you have a junk daycare, if you have that Romanian orphanage study, which I highlighted in the last chapter, where it's just pure neglect, you're going to have very bad outcomes. But if you find an appropriate child care institution, then the child will be fine. So looking at sexual abuse, the estimates vary. It's very hard to get exact numbers of these kind of things because of issues with self-reports. But it's as high as 25% in women and 16% in men have been reported being sexually molested. Many children do not tell anyone. So about the same percentage of children tell someone within the first 24 hours of abuse as the same percentage who never tell anyone. So again, this it makes it very difficult to know the exact statistics when it comes to the sexual abuse in children. The impact of sexual abuse. There's no one distinct syndrome for all abuse victims. About 25% of boys and girls experience anxiety, depression, aggression, and school learning problems. Many after effects involve a lack of self-worth and difficulty trusting. And about 33% sexually act out, behave seductively and promiscuously. And this is theorized to maybe be one mechanism by which um, children can control that pain, can control their sexuality by acting in a sexual way. Impact of sexual abuse. Some display post-stress disorder symptoms, which involve a clinical disorder involving nightmares, flashbacks, helplessness, anxiety. In a few cases, there's severe psychological damage. About 33% show no psychological symptoms, and the impact may be most severe when abuse involves penetration, occurs over a long period of time. So the severity of the sexual abuse and the duration, so kind of like other stressors, impact the negative effects of the abuse. So recoveries of sexual abuse, high quality relationships with parents and friends may lead to better recovery. Psychotherapy aids in treatment of abuse victims, helps treat anxiety and depression, and teaching coping and problem solving skills. So a buffering effect of parents and friends for sexual abuse victims has been found in some studies, and psychotherapy as well is helpful. So looking at sexual offenders, some offenders are juveniles taking advantage of peers and somewhat younger children. And these younger children obviously can still learn acceptable behaviors. They probably had poor parenting themselves, had other issues going on in their lives. And the point is here is that how do you stop these people, these juveniles, from repeating that behavior and become, pro-social members of society? Effective intervention involves working with the survivors, the offenders, and the children on prevention of sexual abuse, maybe behind recent decline in reports of abuse. So kind of this collective approach to obviously helping the victim, but trying to get at the root of the issue, trying to, or not necessarily at the root, but at least the root of the some of the offenders' issues to try and decrease the likelihood of a repeat offense. Impacts of child abuse. Abused and maltreated children have developmental problems across multiple domains, can negatively impact a child's developing brain. Intellectual deficits and economic or academic difficulties are common. Their marriages are more negative and less satisfying, and their relationships with their families are less close. So the idea here is that social or negative social relationships increase the risk for future negative social relationships. How do we stop the violence? Teach positive parenting skills to parents who use harsh parenting techniques. So, if a child is giving you some difficulties, explain to a parent and teach a parent why the techniques they're using are counterproductive and are harmful to the child, in fact. Comprehensive ecological approach designed to convert a pathological family system into a healthy one. So, looking at the entire family dynamics, not just one individual, but how everyone is acting within that family unit and advise the members of the family how to act in more positive ways. Address poverty, the roots of stress, to stop the intergenerational transmission of abuse. So we saw a few previous slides ago that losing a job is associated with child abuse. That doesn't mean that all unemployed people or people lose their job are child abusers, obviously, but it's just a risk factor. So how can we, at a legislative level, in a macroeconomic or a macro system, referring to Bronfenbrenner's systems, how can we as a society reduce that risk factor of job loss resulting in child abuse? Not covering this again. It's still not in the book yet, but I put this here because the book talks about stress in early childhood. Children who experience toxic stress, which we already defined, and who live in extremely stressful situations, abuse over long periods of time can suffer long-lasting effects. Structures in the midbrain system, hippocampus, can be vulnerable to prolonged stress. High levels of stress hormone cortisol can reduce the size of the hippocampus. Stress hormones can reduce immunity to disease. So, like I said before, stress, not good. And I should say, toxic stress, not good. And the longer the toxic stress is present, the more dangerous it is and the more likely it is to lead to negative outcomes within a child. So child poverty in young adults, allostatic load, and we've talked about allostatic load already. And this is just another study here that Evans argues that it's the cumulative effect of stress that impacts a child. It's the collection of these stressors, and evidence for the impact of the stressors are found at the biological level. In our book, finally defines ACEs, which are all types of abuse, neglect, traumatic experience that occurred before the 18 years of age, and they are associated with everything. Again, Google ACEs and then whatever variable you want, and then have fun. When a child experiences strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity without adequate stress system, the child's stress response systems can be activated and disrupt the development of the brain. So those stress response systems, the release of stress hormones over long periods of time, literally impact the development of the brain. And this is seen again at a biological level. And that's all. Thanks, everyone. Like and subscribe to my channel so we can grow our channel and grow our brand. But I hope everyone has a great week in all seriousness. Stay safe. Thanks for listening.